With the IMF slashing Philippine growth forecast for this year and not to below 6%, we check back on Nomura in Singapore, which as early as April 14 trimmed its GDP forecast for the Philippines to 5.9% for this year from 6% previously. With us now for more, live from Singapore is Euben Paracuelles, Chief ASEAN Economist at Nomura. Good to see you again, Euben. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Good morning.
Yeah, a lot has happened in 9 days with the IMF markdowns and growth to boot. Are you still sticking by your 5.9% GDP forecast this year?
Yeah, I'd say at the moment, yeah, that's still a reasonable forecast. But of course, we're noting that uncertainty remains very high, especially on the global trade tensions and U.S. Tariff policy. So obviously that would put the balance of risk to the downside in terms of our growth projections. But obviously, I'd say as well that the Philippines, in terms of the exposure to the external demand, is relatively low, which is why if you look at how much we've cut our forecast, it was about only 0.1 percentage points relative to ASEAN neighbors. For example, Thailand, we have it at now 2% in terms of growth. So that's a big differential. And the bigger factor there is really in terms of how much we think the domestic growth engines could fire up and provide some offset to a potential decline in exports. And, obviously those things are still very much intact regardless of what's happened with the tariffs, investment spending, infrastructure projects. And then, the drop in inflation has become very benign, and I think that provides a lot of support to household spending and purchasing power at the time, and labor market conditions actually also are holding up. So I think domestic demand will become the bigger driver here from a growth standpoint this year.
From the perspective of monetary policy levers, considering the growth engine, domestic-wise, inflation looking pretty benign, how much more of rate cutting are you expecting from the Bangko Sentral? And how much of an interest rate differential do you think would be important for that wide differential to be maintained versus the Fed funds rate?
Yeah, I've always said that the BSP across the central banks that I follow in the region is among the more orthodox inflation targeters. So what that means is they're sticking to this inflation targeting framework and not really too worried about other things like the currency, right? So for as long as inflation remains benign, I think that would give BSP a lot of scope to keep cutting. And yes, alongside our reduction in the growth forecast, we've actually reduced our inflation forecast as well. So we now think headline inflation will average this year to 2.2. So that's at the lower end of BSP's 2 to 4% target. And to me, that really gives them a lot of flexibility to keep cutting, especially in this environment when there are some external headwinds that are putting some pressure on growth. So they could focus on supporting that a little bit. And one thing, Kathy, that I'd point out that gets to be underappreciated a little bit is, they're doing a lot of other things as well, macroprudential measures, especially in the RRR cuts that they've already delivered. So what that does is provide a lot of liquidity into the banking system. And as a result, the policy transmission of the rate cuts that are about to come or already have happened become a bit more effective than otherwise would have been the case in past cycles.
We got about a minute to go. How concerned should we be on getting inundated by cheaper China imports with whatever tariff Trump levels against Beijing?
Again, relatively speaking, for the Philippines, I'm not too worried. There is quite a bit of that, but obviously that means disinflation pressures, which is always positive for the Philippines. Labor market conditions are still okay, so we're not seeing factory closures that we're seeing, for example, in Thailand or Indonesia, and leaving consumer sentiment very weak. As I said before, unemployment rates are still pretty low in the Philippines by historical standards. So I think that would help us support domestic demand going forward, again, regardless of what happens externally.
Got that. Silver linings there in our conversation. Euben Paracuelles, Chief ASEAN Economist at Nomura, live from Singapore.